The demolition crew found the tin box on a Wednesday, wedged behind a collapsed wall in a farmhouse nobody had lived in for 90 years. They almost tossed it straight into the dumpster with the rest of the debris. Rusted through, dented, the kind of thing that usually held nothing but rat nests and rotted newspaper. One of the crew popped the lid anyway, out of habit more than curiosity, and stopped cold. Inside, wrapped in wax paper gone brittle and yellow, were dozens of small glass jars, each one sealed, each one still holding a handful of dried seeds. Corn, wheat, beans in 6 different colors. A label on the largest jar, written in fading pencil, reads simply, "For whoever comes back." Nobody was supposed to come back. The farm had been abandoned since 1936, swallowed by drought and dust and a county-wide exodus that emptied half the township. But the demolition foreman, an older man who'd grown up 2 farms over, knew exactly whose name was on the original deed. He made one phone call before his crew touched another board. That call reached a 29-year-old graphic designer 3 states away. A woman who had never planted so much as a tomato in her life, who barely knew the farm existed, and who was about to inherit 90 acres of dust-cracked Oklahoma prairie and a tin box that would upend everything she thought she understood about her family. If you believe the past sometimes leaves us exactly what we need, long before we know we'll need it, stick around. This one's worth the whole story. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always want to know how far these stories travel. To understand what that tin box meant, you have to go back first. Back to 1934, to a woman named Opal Dunmire, 26 years old, married 4 years, mother to a boy not yet 3. Opal's husband, Everett, worked the same 90 acres his father had broken from raw prairie sod 2 decades earlier, land that had given them good wheat for years before the sky itself seemed to turn against them. The drought came first, the kind that cracked the earth into plates you could lift with your hands. Then came the wind, stripping away topsoil that had taken thousands of years to build, lifting it into black rolling clouds that turned noon into midnight and buried fence lines under drifts of dust that looked, from a distance, almost like snow. Opal kept a diary that survived, water-stained and half illegible in places, and in it she described sealing wet sheets over the windows just to keep her son, breathing through the worst of the storms, and still finding dust an inch thick on the kitchen table by morning. Most of the county's crops failed outright that year, and failed again the year after. Cattle starved standing in fields that had been pasture a decade before. Families packed what fit into trucks and left for California, for anywhere that wasn't this. The Dunmires held on longer than most, mostly because Everett refused to believe the land was finished. But Opal, watching her son grow thinner on what little they could still grow, in a garden plot she fought the wind for every single day, made a decision her husband didn't fully understand at the time. She started saving seed, not just from what survived that year, but specifically from the plants that survived best. The bean vines that hadn't wilted in the worst heat, the corn stalks that had somehow tasseled, even with roots in cracked, bone-dry soil. She didn't have a word for what she was doing. Nobody in the county was talking about drought resistance or seed selection with any formal language. But she understood something simple and stubborn. If a plant lived when everything around it died, its children might live too. She saved seed for 3 straight years, sorting it by hand at her kitchen table, sealing it in whatever jars she could find, writing dates and notes in pencil on scraps of paper tucked inside. Her neighbors thought she was strange for it. Seed saving wasn't unusual on its own. Most farm wives did it, but Opal was selective in a way that struck people as almost superstitious, walking her rows during the worst of the dust storms to mark which plants were still standing before she'd let anyone touch them for the pot. By 1936, the drought had beaten Everett in a way the dust never fully beat Opal. He took work on a road crew in California that spring, promising to send for her and their son once he'd saved enough. Opal packed the house, sold what livestock hadn't already died, and prepared to follow him west with everyone else leaving the county that year. But before she left, she did something that made no obvious sense. She took every jar of seed she'd saved, 3 years of careful selection, the only thing on that farm that had actually gotten stronger instead of weaker, and hid them inside a tin box behind a wall. she and Everett had built together the year they were married. She wrote the note by lamplight the night before the truck came, "For whoever comes back." Then she nailed the wall shut and never spoke of it again, not even to her son when he was old enough to ask about the farm. Nobody came back. Not Opal, who died in California in 1971 without ever seeing Oklahoma again. Not her son, who grew up believing the family's farming history ended with dust and heartbreak and nothing worth remembering. The land sat abandoned, sold for back taxes decades later to a holding company that did nothing with it but pay the bill, until a construction firm bought it this year to clear the last standing structure for a solar development. That's where Margaret Voss enters the story, though at the time she went by Meg, and she had no idea any of this history existed. She was Opal's great-granddaughter, raised in Sacramento, 2 generations removed from anyone who'd ever touched Oklahoma soil. Her grandfather, Opal's son, had died when Meg was a teenager, and whatever he knew about the farm he'd never passed down. Maybe because he genuinely didn't know much himself. The phone call from the demolition foreman reached Meg on an ordinary Tuesday between client meetings. A stranger telling her she owned 90 acres of land she'd never heard of, and that his crew had found something she needed to come see in person. She almost didn't go. It was a 14-hour drive for what sounded, frankly, like a scam or a waste of a week's vacation time. But something about the man's voice, careful and oddly reverent, describing a box that had survived nearly a century sealed inside a wall, made her get in the car. If you enjoy stories about hidden history, forgotten resilience, and land that remembers more than the people who left it, subscribe and join us for more every week. What Meg found when she arrived was not the farm she'd pictured. 90 acres of scrub prairie, a collapsed barn, and a farmhouse missing half its roof, exactly the kind of ruin the county was full of. But the foreman handed her the tin box before his crew touched another board, and standing in the wreckage of a house she'd never known existed, Meg opened it for the first time. Dozens of small jars, corn kernels striped in colors she didn't recognize, beans in deep maroon and speckled cream, wheat that looked nothing like anything she'd seen in a grocery store, and beneath the jars, folded flat at the bottom of the box, pages torn from what turned out to be Opal's diary, describing storms Meg had only ever read about in history textbooks. She had no idea what any of it meant, practically speaking. Seeds that old, she assumed, were almost certainly dead. But she couldn't bring herself to throw them away, not after reading her great-grandmother's handwriting, describing dust so thick it buried fence posts. She drove the jars to the nearest agricultural extension office, 90 minutes away, mostly just wanting someone to tell her whether any of it was real. That's where she met Dr. Wendell Cass, a seed conservation specialist who'd spent nearly 30 years studying heirloom and heritage crop varieties across the Plains states. He didn't laugh at her question, which she appreciated, but he didn't get excited either, not at first. Seed viability after 90 years, he told her, was almost always zero. Moisture, temperature swings, decades of neglect. Nearly all seed that old was dead weight, historically interesting at best. But he tested it anyway, because that was the job. And 3 weeks later, he called Meg back with news that surprised even him. A portion of the corn and roughly a third of the bean varieties had germinated. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. Wendell told her later it was one of the highest viability rates he'd ever seen in seed that old, and he suspected it had everything to do with how carefully Opal had dried and sealed it before hiding it away, sorting it in a way that, without ever using the term, amounted to real seed science. That call changed something in Meg. She'd gone from mildly curious to something closer to obsessed, driving back out to the farm every weekend she could manage, reading everything she could find about drought-tolerant heirloom varieties, and asking Wendell a question that had been forming since the moment she read her great-grandmother's diary. Could these seeds actually be grown again? At scale? On the same land they came from? Wendell was cautious. Growing out a small viable sample in a controlled nursery bed was one thing. Farming 90 acres of neglected, eroded prairie soil that hadn't been properly worked in nearly a century was an entirely different problem. And he told her plainly that most people who tried something like this failed within the first 2 years. usually from underestimating how much the land itself needed to heal before it could support anything again. Meg didn't have farming experience, didn't have equipment, and didn't have anywhere close to the money a real restoration would require. What she had was a design career she could work remotely, savings she was terrified to spend, and a note in her great-grandmother's handwriting that she couldn't stop thinking about. For whoever comes back. She quit renting her apartment within the month and moved into the one room of the farmhouse with a roof still intact. Her first season taught her how little she actually understood. She planted a full acre of the germinated corn without testing the soil first, and lost nearly 60% of it to compacted earth so depleted it barely held water. Wendell, when she called him in defeat, didn't say he'd warned her, though he had. He drove out instead and walked the fields with her, showing her how to read soil structure by hand, explaining that decades of wind erosion had stripped away exactly the organic layer her great-grandmother's plants had once grown in, and that rebuilding it would take cover crops and patience before it would take anything worth harvesting. Her second mistake nearly ended things entirely. She planted the rare heirloom beans too early, before the last frost risk had fully passed, and lost the entire test plot overnight to a late cold snap nobody had forecasted with any confidence. It was the only sample of that particular bean variety she had. Wendell didn't sugarcoat it. Once a small isolated seed line is gone, he told her it's gone. You don't get replacement heirlooms from a catalog. That failure sat with her for weeks, the closest she came to giving up entirely. But the corn, planted properly the second time in soil she'd spent months rebuilding with cover crops and compost, came up strong that summer, tasseling in July heat that would have killed most commercial hybrids, planted in the same depleted ground. Neighbors who'd watched her struggle all spring started slowing their trucks on the county road, the same way people once slowed down to gawk at Opal's dust-choked fields 90 years before. Except this time they were watching something grow instead of watching something die. An old farmer named Gideon Ray, who'd worked adjoining land his whole life and remembered his own grandfather talking about the Dunmire place, started stopping by uninvited, standing at the fence line without saying much, the way old-timers do when they're deciding whether something is worth their attention. He eventually admitted he never thought anything would grow on that particular stretch of ground again in his lifetime. By the following year, Meg had expanded to 4 acres, working with Wendell to properly document and register the surviving heirloom varieties. Seed that turned out to carry genuine drought tolerance traits modern breeders had spent decades trying to reintroduce into commercial corn and wheat lines through far more expensive means. A university research program reached out, wanting to study the corn's root structure and water efficiency. A small regional seed company, focused entirely on climate-resilient heirloom varieties, offered her a contract to grow and supply seed stock at a scale she'd never attempted. It terrified her as much as it excited her. She took out a loan to properly restore the second barn, hired her first 2 workers, both from families who'd farmed the county for generations, and began the slow work of turning 90 acres of forgotten prairie back into something that could actually sustain itself. By year 3, Meg's seed had been planted in test plots across 4 states, part of a growing effort to bring drought-resilient heirloom genetics back into modern farming, as the same kind of extreme weather that broke her great-grandmother's generation started showing up again in new forms. A seed bank in Colorado asked to archive samples of every variety she'd recovered, insurance against the possibility that any single farm, even hers, could still lose everything to a single bad season. Meg agreed without hesitation, understanding now, in a way she hadn't before, exactly why Opal had never trusted survival to one location alone. The corn itself became something of a small sensation among agricultural researchers, its root structure reaching nearly twice as deep as modern hybrid varieties, a trait that let it pull moisture from soil layers most commercial corn never touched. Wendell, presenting findings at a regional conference that spring, credited the discovery not to any laboratory, but to a farm wife with a pencil in a wall cavity in 1936, a detail that made the room go quiet in a way data rarely did on its own. She'd built something her great-grandmother could never have imagined, using nothing but what Opal had left sealed inside a wall out of what looked, to everyone around her at the time, like sentiment or superstition. Standing in the restored garden that first autumn, holding a handful of dry corn kernels, striped in colors. Nobody had grown in nearly a century. Meg finally understood what her great-grandmother's note had actually meant. It wasn't really addressed to a stranger or even fully to family. It was addressed to anyone patient enough to notice that survival, real survival, isn't loud. It's quiet and stubborn, and it waits, sometimes for generations, for someone willing to open the box. The land doesn't forget, Wendell told her once, standing at the edge of a field that had been dust for 90 years and was now, finally, green again. It just waits for someone to remember it was never actually finished. If your family has a story like this one, something forgotten, something kept, something waiting to be found again, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people building something extraordinary out of what everyone else left behind.